That you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy upon you.
She was just 18 when the state of Tennessee sent her to death row, the youngest woman in America to face execution in the modern era. And now, nearly 30 years later, a date has been set. If carried out, Christa Pike will become the first woman executed in Tennessee for a crime she committed as a teenager. In court that day, she broke down crying, not the tears of innocence, but disbelief. Her hands shook as the judge read the words, "Death by electrocution." At that moment, she wasn't the smiling Job Corps student anymore. She was a child staring into an ending she never imagined. But to understand how a teenage girl ended up here, we have to go back further, to a life shaped by neglect, abuse, and instability. Born to parents who fought, divorced, and remarried while barely caring for her, Christa grew up bouncing between homes, sometimes left alone, crawling through unsanitary floors, surviving severe seizures without proper care. Her grandmother, the one person who showed her love, died when she was 12. That loss left a void that jealousy, obsession, and rage would eventually fill. Her teenage years brought violence, both received and inflicted. She was expelled, ran afoul of the law, and later in prison, she attacked another inmate, wrapping a shoelace around her neck in an attempted strangulation. Even decades later, she remained a figure capable of manipulation, aware of an elaborate escape plot involving a corrections officer and an outside accomplice, foiled only by authorities. To understand why Christa Pike became one of Tennessee's most notorious figures, we have to go back to January 12, 1995, behind the old University of Tennessee steam plant, where a friendship turned into murder. A night of rage, ritual, and cruelty that still haunts the state today. Drop a comment and let me know. Was justice served? Or did the system fail another broken mind? And don't forget to like the video so more people hear this story. 1976, Beckley, West Virginia. Christa Pike was born a premature baby. From the very start, her life was unsteady. Her parents, Carissa Hansen and Emil Glenn Pike, fought, divorced, remarried, and divorced again. Love was inconsistent. Neglect was constant. Christa later said her paternal grandmother was the only person who ever truly cared for her, the only anchor in a childhood defined by chaos. As a baby, Christa crawled through piles of filth while her parents lived their own lives, partying and ignoring her needs. When she suffered severe seizures, her cries went largely unheard. By the time she was in 3rd grade, despair led her to attempt an overdose of acetaminophen. She received psychiatric care, but the support was fragmented, a patchwork that couldn't fix the deeper wounds. At 12, her grandmother died. Christa tried to take her own life again. Around her, the world felt unsafe, unpredictable. And in that insecurity, rage, and obsession began to take root. Her teenage years only deepened the instability. She lived in homes where violence was both inflicted and absorbed. A mother's boyfriend punched her in the face after she chased him with a butter knife. Living with her father's new family ended when a half-sister accused her of molestation. She claimed she had been sexually assaulted multiple times, though family and friends sometimes questioned her versions of events. She fought back too. In one incident, she and a friend beat a man who threatened her mother, school never brought stability. Christa moved often, struggled to focus, and fell behind. A year in a juvenile facility gave her structure, and there she first learned about the Job Corps, a program offering vocational training and a fresh start. She completed her GED, dreamed of being a nursing assistant. Then came Knoxville, Tennessee, and the Job Corps Center. There she met Tatterall's Ship, a year younger, quiet, obsessed with dark symbols and ritual. They became inseparable. Together, they explored the occult, power, and control, things Christa had been denied her whole life. By 18, Christa Pike carried with her a lifetime of trauma, secrecy, and anger. She had never learned how to manage jealousy or disappointment, how to navigate conflict without violence. And on January 12, 1995, all of it would come together, in a way that would shock Tennessee forever. It was Thursday night, January 12, 1995. 18-year-old Christa Pike walked across the Knoxville Job Corps campus with her boyfriend, 17-year-old Tatterall's Ship. They'd been arguing earlier in the day about another student, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer. Christa believed Colleen was trying to flirt with Tatterall, and jealousy had been building for weeks. That night, she told her friend Shadala Peterson she wanted to scare Colleen, teach her a lesson. Just after dark, Christa found Colleen in the courtyard. She smiled and told her it was time to talk things out. No fighting, just to clear the air. Colleen agreed. The three of them, Christa, Tatterall, and Colleen, left campus through a side path that ran along the railroad tracks. Shadala followed a short distance behind, nervous but curious. The walk was quiet at first. They passed the old greenhouses and headed toward the University of Tennessee steam plant, a patch of overgrown field behind a chain-link fence, hidden from the streetlights. Once they were deep enough that no one could hear them, the tone changed. Christa stopped walking. She turned to Colleen and said, "So you like my boyfriend, huh?" Colleen froze. She said no, that it wasn't true, that she didn't want trouble. But Christa wasn't listening. The argument grew louder. Tatterall stood nearby, silent, watching. Christa shoved Colleen, then hit her. Colleen tried to back away, confused, scared, pleading for them to stop. Christa pulled a small box cutter from her pocket and slashed at her arm. Colleen screamed. Christa laughed. The sound carried through the cold air, then vanished into the trees. For the next 45 minutes, what happened was not a fight. It was torture. Christa cut Colleen's chest and face, shouting at her, calling her names. When Colleen tried to run, Tatterall grabbed her and pulled her back. She begged to go home. "Please, I won't tell anyone," she said over and over. Christa didn't stop. She carved a pentagram into Colleen's chest, mocking her as she cried. At one point, Christa looked at Tatterall and said, "Do it." He hesitated, then kicked Colleen as she lay on the ground. The beating continued. Fists, rocks, blades. Colleen's voice grew weaker. She was still alive when Christa picked up a piece of broken asphalt, heavy and sharp on one edge. She raised it above her head and brought it down hard. Once, then again. The sound ended everything. When it was over, Colleen's body was still, her clothes torn, her face barely recognizable. The pentagram was visible under the blood. Christa crouched beside her and stared for a moment. Then she smiled. She reached down, picked up a small piece of bone from the wound, and wrapped it in a napkin. A trophy. The three of them left the woods before midnight. Shadala, who had watched part of it from a distance, followed them back to the dorms. Christa was still talking about what she had done, almost proud. She told Tatterall it felt good to make her pay. Back inside the Job Corps Center, while others slept, Christa cleaned herself up and hid the piece of bone in her jacket pocket. The next morning, students noticed Colleen was missing. Some said she must have gone home. Others whispered about a fight the night before. Christa laughed and said, "She got what she deserved." Nobody thought she meant it literally. Later that day, on the far side of the University of Tennessee agricultural campus, a groundskeeper found something strange near the fence line, a shoe, then a body. Police were called immediately. The scene told its own story. A young woman beaten to death, marked with symbols, left in the dirt like she'd been part of some dark ritual. By nightfall, word spread back to the Job Corps Center. Students started whispering that Christa had been bragging about killing Colleen. One girl said she'd seen Christa showing off something wrapped in a napkin, calling it a souvenir. By the morning of January 13, 1995, Knoxville police were already at the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. A young woman's body had been found behind the steam plant, beaten, bloodied, marked with a pentagram. The groundskeeper who discovered her called it in immediately. Detectives arrived and quickly realized the brutality of what they were looking at. This was not a random attack. Back at the Job Corps Center, students were talking. Some noticed Colleen Slemmer had never returned to her dorm the night before. Her bed remained untouched, her belongings in place. Others whispered that Christa Pike had been bragging, showing a small object in her jacket, calling it a souvenir. The first interview was with Shadala Peterson, the student who had followed them part of the way the night of the murder. She was hesitant, nervous, unsure what she had seen, but under questioning she began to speak. She described how Christa had led Colleen into the woods, how the argument escalated, how she had seen Christa strike Colleen. Peterson's statements were detailed enough to give detectives a timeline and a picture of the events that led to death. Police then went to Christa Pike and Tatterall Shipp's dorm rooms. They found Christa calm, composed, almost eager to talk. She wasn't hiding, and she didn't protest. In her jacket pocket, officers found a small piece of bone, later identified as part of Colleen's skull. Christa smiled when she showed it to them, as if she wanted them to see, to understand. Detectives interviewed her for hours. She described the attack in chilling detail. She recounted the pentagram she had carved, the blows with the asphalt block, the way she watched Colleen struggle. She spoke of fear, anger, jealousy, and control, not with guilt, but with a strange pride. Tatterall Shipp, who had joined in the attack, was quieter, less animated. He admitted to holding Colleen down, but Christa was the one orchestrating the violence. By the end of the first day of questioning, the pieces fit together. Police had statements from a witness, a confession from Christa, physical evidence linking her directly to the crime, and an accomplice who corroborated parts of the story. It was clear this was premeditated. This wasn't an impulsive fight. It was a planned act of cruelty born from jealousy and obsession. Christa's behavior left detectives unsettled. One investigator later said he had never seen anyone confess to murder with such giddiness. She didn't hide the details. She laughed at moments, described how Colleen begged, how she finally struck the fatal blow, and how she kept a piece of her skull. Her willingness to recount the killing in detail made it difficult to separate the crime from the person. Within 48 hours, Christa Pike went from being a student at Job Corps to the prime suspect, to a confessed killer. Tatterall Shipp was arrested in the same period. while Shadala Peterson cooperated fully and eventually received probation for her role. By the time the police finished gathering evidence, the story of that night was clear. Christa Pike had led a peer into the woods, tortured her for almost an hour, and killed her. She had taken a trophy from the crime scene. She did not run. She did not hide. She had left a trail for authorities, and they followed it straight to her. The investigation had begun with a body in the dirt and ended with a confession so detailed it left everyone involved questioning how someone so young could commit such calculated cruelty. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was a window into a mind consumed by jealousy, obsession, and rage. A mind that would soon face justice. By March 1996, Christa Pike's case had drawn national attention. The courtroom in Knoxville was packed. Journalists lined the walls. Families of the victims sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief. Locals came, some out of curiosity, some out of disbelief. The trial wasn't just about a murder. It was about understanding how an 18-year-old girl could commit something so brutal. Christa Pike entered the courtroom with her hair neatly combed, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Her attorneys sat beside her, ready to present a defense rooted in her history of abuse, mental illness, and trauma. Prosecutors, on the other hand, painted a stark picture, premeditated, methodical, and cruel. They laid out every detail from the night of January 12, 1995. The lure into the woods, the argument, the box cutter, the pentagram carved into Colleen Slemmer's chest, and the small piece of skull Christa had kept as a trophy. Witnesses described the events leading up to the killing. Shadala Peterson recounted what she had seen from a distance. Tatterall's ship admitted to holding Colleen down while Christa carried out the attack. Experts testified about Christa's behavior during interrogation, noting her giddiness, her calm descriptions of the violence, and her apparent pride in what she had done. Each piece of testimony reinforced the image of a young woman in full control of her actions. The defense tried to shift focus to Christa's past. They spoke of beatings, neglect, and abandonment, emphasizing the psychological impact of years of trauma. Doctors testified about bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress, and brain abnormalities consistent with early abuse. But the jury spent little time on mitigation. In less than 30 minutes, the defense's arguments were overshadowed by the evidence of premeditation and brutality. When the verdict was read, the courtroom went silent. Guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Death by electrocution. Christa's reaction was immediate. She cried, hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. Part of it was disbelief, part the weight of the sentence itself. For her, it was a moment where reality collided with the consequences of her actions. She had been 18, legally an adult, and now faced the ultimate punishment for a crime born out of jealousy, rage, and obsession. Tatterall's ship, by contrast, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Shadala Peterson, who cooperated fully, received 6 years probation. 1 year, one single year, had separated Christa from Tatterall, a difference that decided life and death. For Colleen Slemmer's mother, May Martinez, the sentence represented long-awaited justice. For others, it raised questions about youth, mental illness, and the role of trauma in shaping criminal behavior. The trial ended, but the debate over Christa Pike's fate was only beginning. After her sentencing, Christa Pike was moved to the Tennessee Prison for Women. She became the only woman on death row in the state. Her cell measured 12 feet long by 7 feet wide. For most of the day, she was alone. No conversation, no touch, no human contact beyond a steel door and a small glass window. But Pike's violent tendencies didn't end with her conviction. In 2001, she attacked another inmate, wrapping a shoelace around the woman's neck in an attempted strangulation. The victim survived, but the incident confirmed that Pike remained dangerous even after decades in isolation. Her legal team filed appeal after appeal. They argued her youth at the time of the murder, her documented mental illness, and the traumatic upbringing that shaped her actions should spare her from execution. They cited research showing that impulse control and judgment continue to mature well into the 20s. They argued that executing her after decades of solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment. The courts rejected every claim. Each appeal reaffirmed that the brutality of her crime outweighed any mitigating factor. Pike's notoriety didn't end with violence inside the prison. In 2012, it was revealed that she was aware of an elaborate escape plot. A New Jersey man, Donald Kohut, had begun visiting her regularly, and he, along with corrections officer Justin Heflin, planned to duplicate a prison key to help her escape. Authorities intervened before the plot could advance, leading to Kohut's imprisonment and Heflin losing his job and facing charges. Pike herself was never charged, but the plot underscored her ongoing influence and manipulation, even from behind bars. For nearly 3 decades, Pike lived in a limbo between life and death. Her days were rigid and repetitive. A few hours in a small caged yard, meals alone, hours staring at walls. Isolation took its toll. She cut herself, attempted suicide, and suffered hallucinations. Psychologists described her condition as consistent with long-term solitary confinement, fractured, unstable, haunted by her own mind. In 2024, a federal settlement allowed some change. Civil rights lawyers argued that such prolonged isolation constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The court agreed. Christa was finally allowed to eat with other inmates, to hold prison jobs, and step outside without restraints. For the first time in decades, she could hear other voices, feel human presence beyond guards and glass. But even with this small reprieve, the shadow of death remained. In 2025, Tennessee issued an execution warrant. Christa Pike's sentence, carried through nearly 3 decades of isolation and appeals, was scheduled for September 30th, 2026. She would become the first woman executed in Tennessee in over 200 years, the only woman sentenced to die for a crime committed at age 18. Death row had not changed her past, and it could not erase the crime. It had only magnified the consequences, forcing a young woman to live every day in the shadow of a sentence she had received as a teenager. A punishment measured not just in years, but in the quiet erosion of a human mind. By 2025, Christa Pike had spent nearly 30 years on death row. Her appeals had been rejected at every level. Courts had considered her age, her history of abuse, her mental health diagnoses, bipolar disorder, PTSD, and early brain trauma, but none of it was enough to overturn the sentence. The state was clear. The brutality of the crime outweighed any mitigating factor. For Colleen Slemmer's mother, May Martinez, justice had taken far too long. She had spent decades visiting her daughter's grave, watching the world move on while her child's life had ended violently. When the execution date was set for September 30th, 2026, Martinez said simply, "Justice delayed is justice denied." For her, Christa Pike had stolen her daughter, and now, finally, the system would deliver accountability. Christa's lawyers argued the opposite. They pointed to the nearly 30 years she had already spent in isolation, the psychological toll of solitary confinement, and research showing the teenage brain continues developing well into the 20s. They said executing someone after decades of living under conditions that caused hallucinations, self-harm, and severe mental strain was punishment beyond measure, a living death already served. The debate extended beyond the courtroom. Neuroscience, cultural shifts, and Supreme Court rulings had begun reshaping how the nation viewed young offenders. The Roper v. Simmons decision banned executions for those under 17. Miller v. Alabama limited mandatory life without parole for minors. Pike had been 18 and 9 months old. Legally, she was an adult. Psychologically, her brain was still maturing, 1 year younger, and she would have been protected. The questions lingered. Should age, trauma, or mental illness factor into punishment for a crime so violent? Was nearly 3 decades of confinement enough? Or did the state have a responsibility to carry out the original sentence? Was this justice or vengeance that refused to die? For Christa, the future remained uncertain. She had changed during those years, grown older, experienced remorse, faced her own fragility and isolation. But the shadow of the crime she committed at 18 had never lifted. For Martinez, every day without her daughter was a reminder that some losses can never be repaired. As the execution date approached, Tennessee prepared to carry out a sentence nearly 30 years in the making. The state's youngest woman on death row, the only woman sentenced to die for a crime committed as a teenager, was now at the center of a national debate about justice, mercy, and the cost of revenge. In the end, the story of Christa Pike forces one question. When a teenager commits a crime that shocks the world, do we punish the person they were or the person they have become?